Today, I'd like to take a look at the Christian and the Buddhist perspective in terms of anger, resolving anger, how we get over anger, and how we move on to have a more fruitful life. Um, One way out of anger that we can look at in terms of the Buddhist perspective is, what is the hurt that has caused my anger? A lot of times when we're dealing with anger issues, there's an underlying experience. And from the Buddhist perspective, it's great to kind of unpack that a little bit and to look at, well, what might be provoking and triggering this anger within me? It takes some time to, take that anger that we're feeling, to meditate about it, look at the circumstances, what caused it, and gradually, sometimes in the Buddhist experience, there's kind of an unfolding. And when we do that, we can look more fruitfully at that anger and see what really is at the root of that anger. Another aspect in terms of the Buddhist perspective is fear. A lot of times anger and fear can be interrelated. If I get angry at somebody or if I'm angry at a certain situation, one of the things I have to consider is, well, what am I afraid of? What has triggered this within me? Am I afraid of a certain situation? Am I afraid of maybe facing my own mortality in a certain situation? Am I afraid that I will not succeed in something? And that this other person that I'm very angry at, maybe a person at work, seems to be succeeding in a better way than I am. They seem to be getting more recognition, more promotions, and I've got this anger. But again, what is my fear? My fear that I will not do as well. My fear that I will not succeed. And facing that fear and realizing that God has given us so many gifts. Again, in the Buddhist sense of facing that through meditation, the Christian perspective through prayer. And this is where our Buddhist and Christian perspective certainly would come together in terms of reflecting, praying, and asking God for a path, a direction out of anger into a more peaceful way of dealing with the situation. If we have compassion for ourselves and admit our own vulnerability, we can have a compassion for others. So sometimes it's being too hard on ourselves that can lead to a certain anger. We get frustrated. Well, why didn't I do better in that situation? Well, wait a minute. What was happening in my life at that point? What were some of the factors that I was dealing with? And having more compassion for ourselves, not being so hard on ourselves, not being overly demanding on ourselves. Demanding, of course. We want to rise to the challenge, we want to do better, but that fine line between being demanding and not having compassion for our vulnerabilities or weaknesses. We all have them. There are all certain areas that maybe we don't do as well as in other areas, and that's fine. We have to have this understanding and compassion for ourselves. And really, that compassion for ourselves then can lead to compassion for that other person who evoked my anger. So we step back and we say, gee, I've made mistakes too. I'm not perfect. And we have a little gentleness and compassion for ourselves. And then we can extend that to another person and say, well, gee, maybe they were having a bad day. Maybe they're going through something stressful in their life. Maybe I should be praying for them. That sense of compassion. And really, from the Buddhist perspective, the idea is compassion for all. Compassion for every aspect of nature. Compassion for human beings, compassion for animals, compassion for flowers and forests and the ocean. And certainly today, one of our primary areas of compassion is ecological compassion. We grieve at what we have done to our planet. So we step back, and with that sense of compassion, we realize that we have to do better. We have to stop polluting. We have to change our consumption patterns. We must be different in order to be compassionate. And that comes from stepping back and, in the Buddhist sense, meditating on our reality, meditating on those areas where we need to have compassion, and meditating on those who might provoke our anger. Instead of responding immediately in anger back, stepping back, taking time to meditate and to find that compassion that is so important. Overcoming our own fears, recognizing our vulnerabilities, and extending that compassion even to those who anger us. Many will raise then the question in terms of anger, well, what about righteous anger? Aren't there some things I should be angry at? Of course, the answer to that is a big yes. And that type of anger really is not about ourselves. But in the Christian perspective now, that anger is about those that are being harmed, those that are being exploited. The incident, of course, in the Christian perspective that everyone raises is the incident of Jesus in the temple, when he overturned the tables of the money changers and wanted to throw them out and say, hey, this is my Father's house. Look what you're doing to it. So Jesus was not angry at himself. He was angry at what was happening to his Father. We must have a spirit of prayer when we come into the Father's house. We mustn't be concerned about money and status, what we're wearing. No, when we come into the Father's house, it's about prayer. It's about praising God, about thanking God for all that we have been given. So from the Christian perspective, certainly there is a righteous anger that is important. And so that anger becomes a tool for justice. Because we see that people are being harmed, they're being exploited, they're not being treated in a fair way. If there is a case of prejudice against someone, and they're discriminated in terms of their employment, in terms of their housing, in terms of their education, their health care, yes, righteous anger is extremely appropriate because people are being harmed. So that anger is important to get across that this is not right. This must change. This is an injustice. And so it becomes a chosen response and not an uncontrollable reaction that just kind of overwhelms us. But we choose that response to get the point home, that there is an injustice here and that injustice must stop.